Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our throwback dress sew-along video. My name is Tilley. I am the designer of the throwback dress and founder of the Tilley handmade sewing pattern line. You can find all of my patterns at antilleyhandmade.com. In part 1's video, we focused on how we wanted to design and interpret our dress by choosing what fabrics we were going to use, by finding our size and getting everything cut out. In this part 2 video, we're going to focus on sewing, construction, and finishing. And what's really is exciting is that we don't have one dress, but we have 5 dresses to sew together today. And I'm really excited about this idea because I've chosen 5 different fabrics and we're going to finish them in different ways. And then we get a chance to see how this pattern can be interpreted by just the fabric choices and the construction choices that you use. This is my personal favorite part of the process, when you've already done all the thinking and you get to sit down and work at your sewing machine. So get your irons plugged in and let's get started. The first dress that I want to start with today is going to be the simplest one to sew, although it's probably the most complicated fabric choice. So this is a novelty mesh or tulle fabric that has this 2D, 3D embroidered imagery on it. So I don't want to do a whole lot in terms of, I don't want to put side seam pockets in this because you're going to see through it. And in terms of the hemming, I might even want to just leave this raw. So we are starting very simple in the beginning. The first step for sewing a dress without side seam pockets is going to be lining up your side seams together, and you're going to be sewing from the bottom of the sleeve through the armpit to the hem on both sides of the dress. For this particular fabric, I think it's going to be the smartest to just use the serger. So instead of sewing at a 1/2 inch with a straight stitch and then finishing my seam allowance, I'm just going to sew the whole thing with the serger instead. Start by lining up the edge at your sleeve and then the edge at your hem, and then make sure these 2 pieces are lined flat with each other and pin equally all the way around. Do this for both sides and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine. We're going to start at the hem of the sleeve, so around the armpit, and go all the way down to the hem of the dress. And just like that, we've already sewn the whole dress together. Now, I chose to do a serged finish for this because I knew that I'd be able to see through, and I just thought that would give it a really minimal look. I also thought the serger would help keep, because the tulle's kind of stretchy, it would help keep it from popping, and it had all these weird embellishments, so I thought the serger would just help keep everything nice and clean in the inside. Otherwise, I would normally do a 1/2 inch straight stitch and then finish my seam allowance with a serger. And if you don't have a serger, you could certainly just use a zigzag stitch in this position. Now, in the instructions for sewing the side seams, I'm showing you how to sew it with a straight stitch and at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And in that case, when you sew such a dramatic curve like this armpit here, that 1/2 inch of seam allowance will make it harder for that curve to sit nicely. So you can either do 2 things. You can either clip notches into the seam allowance to allow it to breathe, or you can trim down the seam allowance. Because I opted to do a serged finish here, it's such a narrow edge that it's actually going to allow this to flex really easily. So it kind of would be the same thing as if you had sewn sewn a zigzag stitch and then just trimmed close to the edge of one side of the zigzag. This way, you just solve the problem of needing this space to relax when it gets turned right side out. So for this particular dress with the mesh material, I'm going to go for the bias tape finish. Luckily, I already have some black bias tape made from a previous project. And for this first one, I'm going to show you how to attach it. And then later on in the video, I need to make some more bias tape for another dress. So I'll show you then how I make bias tape with matching fabric. This fabric would not be appropriate to make matching bias tape out of. So this is just like a black cotton that we're using for the bias tape. So let's install this on the neck. I like to start with just way more bias tape than I'm gonna need, and then I'll show you how I trim it down to fit as I sew. Step one for finishing a neckline with bias tape is to stay stitch all the way around the neck at 1/4 of an inch. Our seam allowance for the neck is 3/8 of an inch, so we want to sew less than that. And this is just going to help hold in this material while we go to sew the bias tape, because there's areas of this fabric, especially when you hit the bias of the fabric, where it becomes really stretchy, and it's really easy to stretch your neckline out at this point. So if you wanted to try your garment on, after you sewed your side seams, I would recommend doing this stay stitch first and then trying the garment on, because that'll help keeping this from stretching out while you're trying it on. I also think this is a new material for me to work with, but I see some spots where I'm going to be stitching directly over some sequins. So I also think it might be important for me to just take the sequins out where I'm going to be stitching. Okay, so I've sewn my stay stitch in, and you can already feel how that stay stitch is adding a sturdiness to this edge. In the instructions, I tell you to work with 1 1/4 inch wide bias tape. And what I tell you to do is I tell you to start by cutting off one of these folds. So see how this fabric has been folded on each edge and the folds kind of sort of meet in the middle? That's what you call single fold bias tape. And the reason why I have you cut this off is basically the bias tape is going to end up looking like this, and it's going to be on the inside here like this, right? So this is where it's going to be after we've sewn it. And so you see how wide that strip is. To me, that's a bit wide for doing a neckline, and especially when you're working with a dramatic curve like our neckline, the narrower you are, the easier it is to work with. So cutting off one of these strips is basically just going to make it a narrower piece of material for us to work with. So we'll actually end up with a finished edge that looks a little bit more like this. And it's just going to make it look really sharp and nice. I'm going to start along one of the long sides of the neck, and I'm going to line up the edge of my tape. I also pressed this open and just got rid of that one fold, and that made it easier to finish trimming it. And we're going to line this up with the edge of our garment. So what I tell you to do is to make a mark on your garment where the bias tape is going to begin and finish. So let's do it right there. I could also use a pin to help me mark such a sheer fabric. And then you're going to mark your bias tape. And make sure you leave a little bit of extra at the top here. So I'm going to mark right here, and this is going to coincide with the mark on the garment. But I'm not going to start sewing there. I'm going to start like an inch down. And then when we get back to there, we're going to fix that, and I'll show you how we're going to connect the beginning and the end. And then now I'm going to sew at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm not going to worry about pinning at this point. I'm just going to kind of line up as I go and sew a little bit and then keep going. You're welcome to pin if you want. When you get back to the beginning of where you started, so I still have a good couple of inches before I meet that original mark that I made, I'm going to pull this the beginning of the bias tape away, and then I'm just going to lay down the end of the bias tape to where I suddenly meet that mark. Okay, so then now I'm going to mark the end of my tape in that same spot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a couple more inches here. I'm going to take this out of the machine, and now I want to connect the beginning and the end together. So the easy way to do this would be that I could just mark that straight line across and cut this off at an extra, whatever your seam allowance is, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And then same here, you could cut down that same seam allowance. Then you could sew, you could go straight across here and sew that straight across. And that's a really easy way to connect the beginning and end. The only downside to that is that it creates a really bulky seam going straight across. So you can do it at a diagonal, which is more challenging, but it makes for a really beautiful finish. And that's the way that all bias tape is typically sewn, is it's sewn at an angle like that. We're going to be sewing this down at 3/8 of an inch, and then this is our initial mark. So this is the exact point that we want these two pieces of bias tape to match up. So I'm going to mark those on both sides. So okay, and then I'm going to line these two pieces of bias tape up, and I want to make sure that those two dots match each other. So you kind of see how I just put that little pin in there, so I kind of have a little bit of a dot. So the beginning of the bias tape is going up and down, and the end of the bias tape is going left and right. And then I'm going to make sure to line up that spot where I want them to stitch together. So here, and I'll pin it together. Okay, so see how it's pinned together. The beginning of the bias tape is straight up and down, and then the back bias tape is left to right. And then we're going to be sewing from corner to corner. And by corner, I mean this spot right here, like where those two create a corner, at a diagonal to where they end right here. Okay, and then now pull this and look at how that suddenly sits flat and it completes our needs. So I know that this maybe feels a little fussy for the first time you do it, but once you physically do it yourself, I think you're going to really understand that it's actually pretty successful. And the nice thing is, because bias is a little stretchy, you know, if you end up being a little off in terms of this matching, you can just kind of, the stretch will just kind of make it fit. So since we know that that's working, I can go ahead and cut off all of this excess material, and then we can finish stitching the bias tape on. So I'm going to go back an inch over where I last stopped the bias tape and start sewing again. For this spot here, I'm just going to finger press our new seam open, and then I'm going to match where we started. So you could certainly have made this easier by just stitching this straight across. It would have been bulkier, and I know that this feels a little fussy in terms of teaching it and showing it, but I think once you do it, you're going to be surprised at how successful it is and what a good finish you get. So from here, what we're going to do is now we're going to allow the material to fold in that original fold, and then we're going to fold everything back to where you just see a little bit of the finished garment towards the inside, and then see how that bias tape is just covering up that raw edge. So there are some areas where the raw edge is extending down past my bias tape, and all I need to do there is just trim it down to hide it. Okay, now that we trimmed down our seam allowance, we're going to be taking this bias tape and turning it to the inside of our garment. We want to be able to see a little bit of our outside fabric rolled just a little bit to the inside like that. And you could use the iron to help you press this. I'm not gonna use the iron for this material just because I know that this material is pure polyester and I don't want to melt anything. So I'm just gonna finger press it. I'm gonna turn it, finger press it, and stitch it as I go. And we're gonna be wanting to stitch as close to this folded edge of the black as we can. So again, sort of like the way I sewed it originally, I'm just gonna fold a little bit as I go so that I don't have to pin the whole thing. But certainly put in pins as much as you want. And we're gonna go all the way around until we meet where we started. That might be a little bit silly. I might need to cut that off. But look at how beautiful and sturdy of a neckline we got with that bias finish. Might have to cut that one off too. But I'm just always amazed for such a delicate fabric how a bias finish can just make something feel so sturdy. The next thing I want to do while I'm sitting at my sewing machine is figure out how I want to finish the sleeves and the hem. So if I wanted to, I could certainly do a bias hem finish for the sleeves, which it does look quite beautiful. Or if you wanted to keep it this like simple raw edge, all I would have you do is just make sure to reinforce this little edge here. And so in my case, since I did this serge, what I would do is I would just kind of do a little tacking stitch right on the edge, and then I can just trim this down and be done with that. So that would be the quick and dirty way to finish a material like this that's not going to fray otherwise, and it helps keep a really clean edge. But you wouldn't want to do the neckline like this because the neckline really needs some durability. This one's an extra large, so it's a little bit big on me. Oh my God, it's cute. It's cute even like over the clothes that I'm wearing right now. How fun is that? Okay, what dress are we gonna sew next? How about this floral version? This one's gonna get side seam pockets, so we'll start with that. So before we sew the side seams together, we need to put the pockets on first. I've cut out 4 pocket bags and they've been marked with a notch for the opening, and those are going to correspond with the notches that I have on the side seam here. So we're going to start by pinning a pocket bag to each side of the side seam. Now we're going to be sewing at our 1/2 inch seam allowance between these 2 notches, and we're going to make a point to backstitch at the beginning and the end and not stitch past the notch at all. So we'll do that 4 times for each pocket piece. After sewing this, I find it helpful to clip these notches a little bit more and go clip towards where your stitch ended, but don't go all the way there. If you clip both sides, now you can go ahead and finish this seam allowance if you want, in whatever way you're going to choose. So I think I'm just going to serge this. And so now we're going to go back to lining up our side seams. And from here, you're going to want to line up. I like to kind of pin my beginning and end points. So I'm going to pin at the hem. I'm going to pin at the sleeve, and then I can pin the rest of my side seam together. And in this case, since we have a side seam pocket, we want to make sure that that's lined up too. So I like to put my pin in like right at this pivot point, like where their notch hits and where our stitch ends. Put my pin in, and then I can find the same spot on the other side and make sure that those two edges are lined up exactly. And then I can put the pin in like normal and know that that's going to line up. And then both of these pocket bags should line up with each other as well. And again, because we notched that, it makes it easier. You'll see how it'll make it easier for us to sew this together. Then you can pin all the way around your pocket bag. You can see actually that my pocket bag doesn't line up perfectly at the top here. Let's see if I might be able to zhuzh it. But ultimately what matters more, oh yeah, it does kind of line up now. But what matters most is that this lines up, and then you can kind of let this sit the way it's gonna sit. This is only gonna be in the inside. So we want it to be flat more than the edges perfectly lined up. And then you can go ahead and line up the rest of your seam from the bottom of the pocket to the hem. And then you can line up and pin the rest of your side seam and then bring it over to the sewing machine. We're now going to sew at 1/2 inch. And I always like to start sewing from the top of the garment to the bottom. So I'm starting at the hem of the sleeve and going to the bottom of the dress. You're going to want to stitch till you hit the top of where your stitch stopped on your pocket, and this is going to become a pivot point. So we're going to stitch to here, keep our needle down on the machine, lift our presser foot, and we're going to pivot, and then we're going to start following the edge of the pocket bag, also at 1/2 inch. I'm also going to make it so that my seam allowance for my pocket bags, these two are facing my pocket bag. So I'm going to make sure that both of those are going in this direction. I'm going to start by shooting towards the tip of that stitch, maybe overlap it by 1 stitch. My needle's down, I'm going to lift my foot up and I'm going to pivot. And this is a little bit more than 1/2 inch, but I'm not going to worry about that. You know, pocket bags are forgiving things, they're only in the inside. These pocket bags are kind of a goofy shape, but I wanted to make them big enough to fit a smartphone in it because it drives me nuts when I have a pocket that's not big enough to put my phone in. Sometimes it's not worth putting your phone in your pocket because it can drag your garment down when you're wearing it, but sometimes you just need somewhere to throw your phone while you're living your life. Again, here I'm going to make sure that my seam allowances are facing my pocket, and I'm going to shoot towards the top of that stitch. Okay, I might actually have overshot it. There we go. Needle down. Now I can pivot and I can finish sewing the rest of the side seam and end with the back stitch. Okay, we've got one whole side done with the side seam pockets. Let's do the other side. We're now finished with both of our side seams, and we're ready to finish our seam allowance on the stitch we just made. We do want to make sure that we clip the curve just right where it's the most dramatic, right under the armpit. So I'm going to make sure I clip that before I serge. And you can see how that clipping suddenly allows it to sit flat. It's also going to make it easier for us to run this through a serger. So now we're basically done with sewing dress number 2. Probably not going to be able to try this one on because this is a medium. Ugh. Okay, I can still get it on, but this is definitely maybe a touch tight. Fabulous. Okay, so let's talk about edge finishing again. This fabric is nice and opaque, so we don't need a lining for that reason. And it kind of has a more casual look to it, right? It feels more like a summer day dress than like a cocktail wedding reception. And so I think that a little top stitching would look nice. I think that probably my favorite thing to do would be to do just another bias facing for the neckline. And then for the sleeves, I think that this fabric, we probably can turn it under twice and just hem it like we would kind of most normally hemmed things where you're hemming under twice. Sometimes that can be a little tricky when you're dealing with curved edges. Our hem and our sleeves have a little bit of a curve to it, but I don't think it's enough to really affect it. If it didn't seem like it would sit right, another workaround could be you could serge this edge and then just turn it under once and top stitch it. That would be a little bit easier. But I think we're going to do a bias facing, and in that case, I'm going to show you how I'm going to make a bias facing with matching fabric. So the first thing we need to do is create a bias strip of fabric. So the bias, what does the bias mean? Well, in a woven material, you have a straight grain. So if you can see my grid here on my self-healing mat, you have kind of threads that are going straight and we have threads that are going across. Threads that are at a 45-degree angle, we consider that the bias. And what's so great about the bias is that it's stretchy. So if I take a scrap, oh, here's a good piece. Okay. So we know that the selvage is parallel to the straight grain, so you can kind of see if I pull on this, it's very rigid, very stable. If I pull on the cross grain, which is perpendicular to the selvage, it's also very rigid. It has a little bit of a flex to it. We call that mechanical ease. But then if we go at a 45-degree angle, look at how much stretch there's going to be. Look at that. So that's what we're utilizing, is we want to utilize that bias part of the grain to create a stretchy strip of fabric. So I've got a scrap here left over from cutting out my dress. And this is a moment when having a self-healing mat and a rotary cutter is so crucial. I'm going to start by lining up my straight grain with one of the grid lines on my self-healing mat, and I can do one of two things. I can either use the 45-degree line that they put on my mat, or I love these clear see-through kind of quilters rulers. These also have 45-degree grains on here. So if you line up that 45-degree line, which is this one right here, with the edge of the selvage, then I can cut along that ruler. So what would give me the longest scrap that I can get would probably be right here. So let me move this up a little bit. I've lined up my selvage with my 45-degree line, and then I'm going to use the rotary cutter to cut my first line. Okay, now it's going to be really easy because basically I just need to cut parallel to that line. So now all it is a matter of how wide our bias tape is. So I need a 1 1/4 inch wide strip, and I'm not sure that one strip is going to be enough. So I might cut 2 or 3 just to make sure I have enough, and then I'll piece them together till I have a long enough strip to work with. And I kind of like leaving extra bits of bias that I've made, like set up in my studio, so that if I have a little project that I need a little bias tape, I could go ahead and just grab this and use it if I need it, which is exactly what I did with that black for the first dress. Okay, so now I'm just gonna piece this together end to end. We wanna have the strips going at a right angle to each other, and we're gonna sew it at a diagonal, and that's gonna help distribute the bulkiness of the seam when we go to sew this together. So if you have a selvage still on there, that's already kind of a perfect angle to line this up. Another option is if both of your edges were straight, you could put your strips right sides together, but you're gonna have it at that right angle. And then you're gonna sew from corner to corner. So from here to here. And if you're unsure of where to sew, you can always just put a pin in and then unfold it and make sure everything looks right. So let's sew these strips together. Press the seams open that you just sewed and clip those tiny little triangles that you get as a result of the seam allowance. Then we're going to use our bias tape folder. I know that some people feel like they get just as much success without using the folder. I like it. I think it makes this process a little bit faster, but it does take a little zhuzhing. It doesn't just like do it for you. You kind of have to pull it and finesse it before you press it finally through the iron. But basically just the two ends of your bias are coming to meet in the middle, and you want just like a teeny little space between them just to kind of give it a little bit of room to fold nicely. Press your neckline after you finish sewing the bias tape. And while you're over here, we're also going to begin to press our hem edges for our sleeves and our bottom hem. I'm a big fan of pressing just one fold up, somewhere between 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch. For the sleeves, I'm going to sew a double fold, but I'm just going to press one of the folds and then hand turn the second fold when I sew. For the bottom hem, I want a slightly larger hem just because I like the way it looks for the bottom of the dress. And for this one, I'm going to serge the bottom edge, which you can see I've already done. And then I'm going to fold up about 2 inches all the way around. Because this is slightly curved, you are going to find that in areas, it's going to need to gather just a little bit for it to sit flat. And you can kind of hover the iron over top, hit it with the steam and kind of help it ease in. Then you can either sew this with a machine or you can sew this by hand. Of course, by hand, you always get more control, but it's just going to be slower. So here I am folding the hem of the sleeve a second time by hand and then sewing it down close to that folded edge. If you want to finish the hem of your skirt with a stitch on the machine, I like to sew from the wrong side here and just sew as close to the edge of that serge as I can. I did give myself a piece of tape to try to stay in a consistent width away from the edge, but you can see I sort of got a little narrow there. Alternatively, you can sew this by hand. So I would start with creating a knot at the side seam, and then you pick just 2 or 3 threads of fabric from the main body of the dress. and pull that through, and then grab a little bit from the serged edge, which of course you can grab a little bit more because that's not seen. But the idea is that you're sewing this in such a delicate way that you're not seeing anything from the right side of the garment. So certainly if you wanted that more polished look, this is the option, and just take your time and enjoy the process. Now let's sew a throwback dress with a full lining. So I'm going to grab that Poochie-esque rayon fabric, and I'm going to sew side seam pockets and the side seams per normal. Make sure that you press all of your seams, as well as clipping the seam allowance around your armpits. And then you will sew, press, and clip your lining fabric in the exact same way. This time you'll need to make sure to keep a 6 to 8 inch piece of the side seam open so that we can use that to get in and out of the garment when we're sewing the lining. If you forget to leave your opening like I did here, you'll just grab your seam ripper and open it back up as soon as you remember. Next, you will grab your main fabric dress and turn it right side out. You'll leave your lining dress wrong side out. And then basically your main dress is going to sit inside of your lining dress where they match up at the neckline and the sleeves and the hem. We will start connecting the two dresses at the neckline. So you will need to pin these two together. Something I didn't think to do till I was at this point was to make some marks around the neckline of the main fabric as well as the neckline of the lining fabric so that I had reference points to match up. So here I'm just matching up kind of the top of where the shoulder seam would be if we had one, and center front and center back, and marking those with pins. Then I know that I can match the pins from the lining fabric to the pins of the main fabric and make sure that everything is matched up evenly. Sew the dress and lining together all the way around the neckline, ending where you started. Once I've sewn all the way around the neckline, I will make sure to clip into my seam allowance where the curve is the greatest. So the spots on the shoulder where the seam is basically straight, you don't really need any clips, but if you wanted to, you could go ahead and clip the whole thing around. I am not going to stop you. Now we're going to understitch along the neckline seam that we just sewed. So you're going to have to do this awkward thing of like opening up the dress and doing your best to get next to that seam. You want to be on the lining side, and you're going to be sewing about 1/8 of an inch away from your neckline seam on the lining fabric through all of your seam allowances. And what this is going to do is it's going to help the lining fabric sit towards the inside of the garment, and you won't see it on the outside. You don't need to press this before you sew it. You can literally just kind of spread the seam open as you're sewing, and you'll be just fine. Now you can press your neckline into its final position after doing the understitching. At this point, when just the neckline seam is sewn, is probably a good time for you to try the garment on and see if you want to shorten the sleeves or the bottom hem at all. For the rest of attaching this lining, we're going to kind of do it in this weird way. So right now, the dress is in its final state, right? Except for that the edges are raw. To keep ourselves from getting flipped around, we are going to fold the sleeve hem the way that we want to see it when it's finished being sewn. So that means taking the fabric and turning it in towards the wrong side and safety pinning it together. If I don't do it in this way, when I go to turn this inside out to actually sew the seam, I get really confused about how the two sleeves are supposed to go together and what orientation. I've sewn sleeves so many times where I've created this sort of like infinity loop. Anyways, this is the way I've found that makes the most sense for me. So I'm going to repeat this process for both the sleeve hems as well as the bottom hem. Now you can reach into your lining hole that you left in the side seam and grab one of your sleeve seams and pull it out. Here you can see how it's sort of creating a tube, the way that the lining fabric is attached to the main fabric. I did not know for the life of me how to draw this in my instruction booklet, so I'm happy I have this video to show you. So now we can take the pin out, and without losing where those two edges were being held together, we can kind of take the safety pin out and then lay everything out right, line up the edges, and put a regular straight pin in there. And then you can just pin all the way around and sew it. You are going to have to kind of work your way around the mass of the garment, but basically you're going to sew from the beginning to the end around the sleeve hem. For the second sleeve, I got a little smarter and marked a halfway point on the sleeve hem opening on both sides. So I just had an additional mark to match up when I turned it inside out. Finally, you want to press everything really well. I like to very lightly press the seam open before I then press it in half edge to edge. Good pressing makes your sewing so much better. So take your time on this step and do a really nice, thorough job, because this is really going to set the fibers into place and keep your garment looking nicer in its entire longevity. Finally, you need to close up the hole we left in the lining. So if you kind of pinch at the beginning and end of where it's sewn, it'll kind of hold itself together, and then you can just sew really close to the edge to get this shut. If you wanted it to look really, really nice, you could hand sew it, but I've never been bothered to hand sew this part. I think no one's going to notice it. It's going to be just fine. Some immediate feedback I would give, having just finished this fully lined version of the dress, is I would finish the neckline and then try the dress on at that point and see if you want to trim down the sleeves or the bottom hem before you start hemming it, because proportions on this dress are going to be really crucial, especially if you're on the shorter side. Like, having the sleeves not too long and the bottom hem not too long is going to really make this dress look a lot more proportionate, and you can simply just trim it from the bottom up. You don't need to like shorten it from the middle or the way sometimes other patterns do. Also, I would finish the neckline and just see how well each sleeve and hem matches with its lining component, because if the lining is a lot shorter than the main fabric, when you go to sew those together, you're going to get bubbling. Like, the dress is not going to match evenly. Like, the longer side, like let's say the main side is longer than the lining, like you're going to get a bubbling of the main fabric, which is exactly what happened to me with this dress. And it was as simple as just repressing it. I literally had it on my body and just was like repressing it so that the bubble went away. But if I had been smarter, which now I am helping you be smarter, I would have just looked at it, seen how well it lined up, and then trimmed the main garment fabric to match the lining so that they were both even. And then when I know to go sew it together, that they're going to end up evenly. So that's my advice after having finished this one. But other than that, this is a really beautiful dress, and I'm so excited I made it in my size. The next finishing technique I talk about for finishing the neck is using a neck facing. So this would be pattern piece C in your pattern. And a neck facing, or any kind of facing, is basically kind of using one part of a full lining. So as you can see, we're going to be sewing the neck edge here to the garment, and they match. So if you made any changes to your neckline, just make sure that you also made those changes to your neck facing. Just lay it on here and make sure it matches. And then we will get a nice seamless edge here. You will cut out this pattern piece in the same way that you cut out your garment on 2 folds, as well as cutting out a piece of inner facing. While the facing is still folded, you can go ahead and clip some little notches to help you for sewing. So you clip it at center front and center back, and where it folds at the top of the shoulder. After you attach the inner facing to your facing, finish the raw outer edge of your facing, but don't touch the inner edge. The inner edge is what's going to be attached to the neckline. If you haven't marked notches on the neckline of your main garment, go ahead and do that now. If you think about the way it was originally folded when you cut it out, that's where you want to mark. So center front, center back, and the top of the shoulder seam. We'll have these notches marked on the neckline of the main garment as well as the facing, and it's going to make it really easy to line these 2 pieces up together, especially since we don't have any seams here to reference when matching these 2 pieces. All right, so this version of the throwback dress is now complete, and you can see how beautifully finished that facing neck is. And you do have this little bit of flop that you just have to tuck in when you put the garment on. This is nice because you get a really polished finish edge like the way you would with a full lining, but you didn't have to commit to a full lining. Okay, on to the last dress we're gonna sew, the experimental one with the stretchy knit. Okay, we've got the garment put together. I did not decide to do side seam pockets because this fabric is so stretchy that I think a pocket with anything in it is going to really weigh and distort the garment down. Also, I just wanted to be fast, so I didn't do it. But now let's talk about ways that we could finish these edges. So it's a knit fabric, so anything we do needs to have some sort of stretch involved. Although because the sleeve and the hem, like they're not going to really get strained a whole lot, you could just fold this once and put a zigzag stitch in and it would be excellent. for the neckline, you know, you could do some sort of collar piece like you would see on a t-shirt. It's going to give it a casual look. If maybe your neckline is bigger than you want it to be, putting that collar on can help make it a little bit smaller opening. I want to do something a little bit prettier. I might see if I can make bias tape from this material and face this just like the way I did with earlier with the bias facing on the woven garments, and see if I can get away with doing it on a knit fabric. I've never actually tried, so let's just try something new. So I wanted to kind of more accurately see how much this neckline was stretching out due to the nature of the fabric. And so this woven fabric here is some test fabric that I cut with the same size small neck opening, and I actually already turned it under 3/8 of an inch and finished the edge. So this is where the finished edge of the neckline should hit. And I added 5/8 of an inch to this neck opening all the way around when I cut it. So if you look here, that original black line was where I was supposed to have cut, which honestly looks like it's exactly where this neck is sitting. So what that means is that I needed to have taken in the neckline like I did, but I only needed to take it in 3/8 of an inch for it to kind of match really where I want the size small neck opening to sit proportionally on the body. So that's really good information. I went ahead and used my cover stitch to finish these 3 edges because it's just so fast and easy, but you could certainly just fold this once and do a zigzag stitch. You might even be able to do a straight stitch, just a short straight stitch, although that might pop. So, hey, if it always pops, you can just fix it, right? Okay, I finished the knit garment and it looks really great. I actually had a lot of success with doing this sort of bias facing edge. I've never actually finished a neckline like this before, but basically I just cut a piece of 3/4 inch wide strip of my knit fabric, and I actually did it on the straight grain because that was the grain of least stretch, because I didn't want too much stretch. I wanted the bias facing to help me kind of hold in the neck and keep it from stretching out over time. And then I just kind of finished it a little bit like the way I would do a collar, where I closed the bias facing and then I serged it all the way around the neck edge, kind of equidistantly sewing it, and then turned it to the inside. And because knit fabric like has a tendency to curl, it just like kind of curled under the serge, and then I kind of pressed it down. And then I just used a single stitch cover stitch, which is just a chain stitch, but you could do probably just a short straight stitch on your machine and it wouldn't, I mean, there's give there, but there's not much stretch, but it really does feel like it's holding it in. Fun. So I learned something new with this dress, and I think this is a size small, but I might be able to fit into it. So let's see if I can. Check that out. It fits. So this is a size small. I normally am a size large, but in the knit fabric, honestly, this small girl, okay, I'm looking at my mirror right here. This might need to come home with me. And honestly, I really love it with the pants on underneath. Okay, I'll take the pants off. Okay though, how cute cute. This couldn't be an easier garment to wear or to make. I really hope that this video got you excited about maybe wanting to try the throwback dress. Maybe you've already bought the dress. Thank you so much for supporting small. I literally do everything myself in this very studio. I fold every pattern. Well, my husband does help with shipping, so it is a family affair. And if you're interested in purchasing the pattern, you can buy it on my website, AnnTilleyHandmade.com, in print or PDF form. I also hope you got some interesting insight into seeing how I work in my own studio. So if it's a new fabric I've never used or a new fabric for a new pattern, there's always something new to learn and to experiment with and embrace the unknown and be willing to try new things. Like sometimes when I'm not sure if something's gonna work, I'm like, well, just try it and then you know. So I hope that you got a little bit out of that as well. And until next time, my name is Ann Tilley and happy sewing. Mwah.